Hello, this is Eric Jewell, aka Wolfbitten. How you doing today? This is Hot Topics. And everybody likes a good dinosaur story, don't they? Okay. So let's talk about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, we're told, lived about 200 million years roughly. They lived during the Mesozoic age, which is comprised of three ages. You have the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Now, the interesting thing is, this is a really interesting time. The world wasn't like you would expect it to be today. The world looked nothing like it looks today. We have 7 continents today. They only had one continent during this time period, and it was called Pangaea. Now, that was the state of the Earth during the Triassic. It was during the Jurassic, somewhere in the middle of the Jurassic period, that one single continent broke into 2. And then it was roughly the end of the Cretaceous or on into the Tertiary, where it broke into the 7 continents that we know today, and eventually is spread out to the positions that we have today, these 7 continents. But you see, when you only have one continent, that changes things a little bit. Well, quite a bit, actually. Now, the interesting thing about this time is, for a long time, there were large arguments, big arguments about how did these dinosaurs die, what killed them. There was evidence for asteroid impacts, there was evidence for huge, massive volcanic activity, and there was evidence of massive flooding. So everybody argued, but I think the consensus today is that all 3 of these things were responsible for the demise of the dinosaur, and there may have been other things involved too, other factors that we just don't know about. There's a lot of mysteries, actually, that people don't talk about, but they're there. So, now, how do we know that this stuff occurred? How do we know that these things played a role in the demise of the dinosaur? Well, geology tells us, quite frankly. Now, how do we know that this happened this long ago? After all, this is supposed to be a period of at least 65 million years ago to roughly 250, 260, 265 million years ago. How do we know that it was that long ago? Well, we know through radiometric dating, right? Now, what is radiometric dating? Radiometric dating is the idea that certain isotopes have a steady rate of decay, and that one isotope decays into another isotope at a regular rate. For instance, we have C14. We can C14 test things that we suspect are at least 100 years old or under 60, 55, 60,000 years old. And C14 degrades into nitrogen 14. So what they do to measure the age of something, whatever they're testing, they measure the amount of C14 that's present in this sample, and then they measure the amount of nitrogen 14 that's present in that sample. And by comparing how little or how much C14 is left in that sample with how much nitrogen 14 is in that sample, they can figure out an approximate age. By the time you get to 55 or 60,000 years old, there should be no C14 left at all. None. Zero, zip, zilch. The way this works, C14 has a half-life of 5,730 years, give or take 40 years. And at the end of the first half-life, you've only got 50% of the C14 that you originally began with, but you have a proportion amount of nitrogen 14. At the end of the second half-life, or another 5,730 years, you only have 25% of the C14 left, but you have a proportionate amount of nitrogen-14 that has been added to this, because the C14 degraded into the nitrogen-14. And by the end of the third half-life, you've only got 12.5% of the C14 left, and a larger proportional amount of the nitrogen-14. So by the end of 10 half-lives, all you have is approximately 1/10 of 1% of the C14 left, and it's not a measurable amount really that you can work with. So they normally don't C14 test anything that's over 55 or 60,000 years old. 10 half-lives is about the extent you can go before you don't have a measurable amount to work with anymore. So now we also have other dating methods. Like, for instance, we have potassium and argon. Potassium 40 degrades into argon 40. So sometimes they test with that. Sometimes they may test with uranium lead. Uranium will degrade into lead. So all of these are various dating methods that are used. Now, are there any drawbacks to any of this? Is it reliable? That's the question. Well, there are some problems because, quite honestly, it is possible for the mother or daughter element to seep in or out of this particular sample that you may be testing. Water can wash it out, water can wash it in. So, for C14, C14 would be known as the mother, and the nitrogen 14 would be known as the daughter isotope. So it is possible for these mother-daughter isotopes to seep in and out of any particular sample, no matter which method you're using. Now, there's other problems with this too that aren't readily admitted to, but here's some of the problems. For instance, depending on the equipment that you use, with any of these given tests, you can get wildly different results, even using the same isotope, by using different equipment, or even different conditions to test, to run your tests. And, of course, using different isotopes can give you a wildly different date. Potassium argon or uranium lead, for instance, might give you two completely different dates, very wide apart, millions, hundreds of millions of years apart, tens of millions of years apart. So this could present a problem, but the way they do this, like, let's say, for instance, you have a T-Rex bone, and you figure this T-Rex died about 66 million years ago. So you run a test, let's say potassium argon, and the potassium argon comes back and it says, well, this is like 130 million years old. That's a little bit too old. So you run another test, and this other test comes back like 40 million years old, and you say, well, that's too young. So you run another test, and maybe you change your isotope this time. And let's say you use uranium lead, and this test comes back at like 68, 69 million years old, and you say, voila, that's the one that we'll use. So I call this date shopping, and it's kind of a bias, a presuppositional bias. You're presupposing that this is roughly that age, and so you shop and you continue testing until you come up with that age. So that's a problem. Now, there's some other problems with this. For instance, there was when Mount St. Helens blew, there was a fella who grabbed a sample of the lava dome there at Mount St. Helens, and he took it in, and he had a potassium argon test run. And these potassium, even though it was less than 6 years old, the potassium argon test said, well, this sample is 3.5 million years old, this sample's over 2 million years old, when it was just actually 6 years old. So, the fellow did this to prove a point, but people didn't understand that point, and they just jumped all over him. They said, look, you're not supposed to use potassium argon on something that's just 6 years old. Look at what the equipment says. The equipment there is telling you that rock's got to be 2 million years old before this equipment is even going to work on it using the potassium argon method. So, they're admitting to a presuppositional bias. Now, there's other problems with this. Uranium lead, for instance. If you're going to use uranium lead, you have to presuppose it's at least 10 million years old. That's right, 10 million. So, we see there's a lot of problems with this. And this, if we're not careful, can cause a lot of bias. It can put people under a lot of pressure. And a lot of mistakes can be made. And you can build a false paradigm that later on down the road you have to protect. So, to recap all this, here's what we're given. We know that a lot of things played into the extinction during this time. There were asteroid strikes. We have the evidence of the asteroid strikes in several places, not just one. And during all three periods, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. We have such huge volcanic activity that these are referred to as lava floods. Lava floods. Can you believe it? Lava floods. And both of these things resulted in tsunamis, seismic flooding. During the Triassic, for instance, we're told we had like 2 million years of rain and constant flooding over Pangaea. This continent was flooded, and as a matter of fact, it's called global floods. You know, there's a lot of anti-theists out there. There's a lot of atheists out there that say, there's no evidence for global floods. Well, yes, there is, my friend. They're called global floods. They just say it happened 200 million years ago. Now, what if some of these dating methods are wrong? What if they are presupposing that these rocks are at least 10 million years old and they're not? Well, then, we're getting false readings, my friend. Is there any way to prove that we're getting false readings? Well, yes, there is. You see, there are redundant methods that we can use to double-check and triple-check these things. But do they do them? No, they don't. Why don't they do them? Because they're preserving a paradigm. Can I prove what I'm saying? Yes, I can. Alright, my friends, now I want you to meet Mr. Jack Horner. Mr. Jack Horner is an atheist. He's an evolutionist, of course. And he is probably the foremost paleontologist, most famous, until his student came along, Mary Schweitzer, in the world of the last 60, 70 years or more. So, he postulated that T-Rex, for instance, was a family man, that he raised his family. He did not abandon them. He also has discovered a few dinosaurs, and he was the senior science advisor for all three of the first three Jurassic Park movies, and he was the boss of Miss Mary Schweitzer, who probably outdoes him now in fame, because Mary Schweitzer is the one who, in Mr. Jack Horner's lab, found soft tissue in a T-Rex leg bone. Now, let me explain what was not found, first of all. When people hear about soft tissue, you get all sort of reactions. Some people envision, like, meat hanging off the leg. That's not what was there. And then you have some people that deny soft tissue was found at all. That's wrong, too. That's usually the position that atheists and anti-theists take. Oh, they didn't really find soft tissue? Yes, they did. What did they find, actually? Well, they used a compound to dissolve the bone and mineral, and what was left, they were amazed. There was actually vascular tissue. What? Vascular? Yes. Blood veins that were in the bone. Not only were there blood veins, but inside the tracts of these veins were red cell-like structures. They were sure were red blood cells. They also found degraded DNA. Mr. Horner, by the way, is on record saying that he wished they could have recovered enough DNA to actually recreate the dinosaur, because he wants to make a dinosaur. But it was too degraded. It wasn't possible. So he admits to this, and of course, Mary Schweitzer. Well, then, Miss Schweitzer did the bold, the amazing, the unpredictable, and I'm still in awe of her move. And the funny thing is, the atheists and the anti-theists don't even see what she did. She blew the lid off of a cover-up. In a paper from 2011, she mentions that there were, in fact, many dinosaur bones and horns that have been found for decades with soft tissue within them. Many of them, for decades, this has been kept from the public. It hasn't gone viral until Mary. Then she wrote another paper in which she was trying to see how long it is possible to preserve these soft tissues. Can you make them last 65 million years? And in the case of the hadrosaur, 88 million years. Can you do that? Is there any possible way to preserve them this long? Well, she wrote her paper, her famous paper, and she actually did more than postulate possible ways this could happen. She put her ideas to the test. Now, you can find any number of papers out there that'll say, I've got an idea. You could do this, and you could do this. But if they've ever done the test, they failed because they've never had a follow-up. Mary actually put her hypotheses to the test. She thought, well, it could be that possibly iron and oxygen could help preserve the structure, the stability of these structures for a longer period of time. So, she took the hemoglobin of an ostrich, rich in iron and oxygen, and she used that to try to preserve proteins. Now, the blood has several different proteins in it. Some of them have a half-life of 3 days, some of them have a half-life of 6 days, some have a half-life of 9, some a little longer. But Mary ran a series of tests with several different subjects, several different specimens, and she was able to preserve the structure 200-fold. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? A 200-fold preservation. So let's take a look at this, though. 200-fold. Now let's think of something that she actually found that we can measure its half-life. We know that she found collagen, and we know that she found blood vessels. what appear to be red blood cells. So it's probably going to be that she found vascular collagen. But vascular collagen only has a half-life of 60 to 70 days, so let's not use that. Then there's skin collagen. Skin collagen has a half-life of 15 years. That's a bit better, isn't it? But let's not use that. Then we have the collagen that's found in cartilage. Now, she never mentioned finding any cartilage, but it's got a half-life of 117 years. Much more than the 15 or the 60 days. So let's use that. Okay, now remember, after 10 half-lives, you virtually have nothing left. So, let's take those 10 half-lives of 117 years. And how much time does that give us? Well, that's easy. You just add a 0. 117 times 10 equals 1,170. Well, that means those bones are dinosaur bones? Only 1,170. Well, no. Oh, yeah. I forgot to factor in Mary's 200-fold increase. Okay, so let's take 1,170, multiply that by 200, and what do we got? 65 million years? Nope. 40 million? Nope. A million? Nope. How much time do we got? Well, do the math. What's 1,170 times 200? 200-fold. That's 234,000 years. What? That's right. According to Mary, according to her tests, not according to Mary, but according to her tests, which give us the longest possible preservation on record of these materials, 200-fold increase in stability there. There's no other test that gives you a longer stability. 200-fold is the longest we have on record. So, according to her tests, now remember what a test is. A test is falsifiability. You are falsifying whether or not you can preserve these bones for 65 million years. And so far you can't. So far, the oldest of these bones can possibly be, the longest we could possibly preserve these, under the best conditions, is 234,000 years. Those dinosaur bones can't even be as old as mankind. Wait, evolutionists say mankind's been around 234,000 years. So, guess what? There's no time for evolution. What? You can't have a common ancestor for the man and chimp and have man evolve and the chimp evolve from that common ancestor in a 234,000 year period. Now, we're told that the Archaeopteryx and the modern bird evolved from the dinosaur, the theropod dinosaur. But yet, if the dinosaur died out less than 234,000 years ago, how's that going to happen? It's not. You can't have that. That is falsified right now. Can they change that later in the future? Maybe. Maybe they'll find a way that it can be miraculously preserved for 65 million years, but they don't need just a 200-fold increase. They need a 680,000-fold increase to get a 117-year half-life to be preserved for 88 million years. In the case of the hadrosaur, it was supposed to be 88 million years old. 680,000-fold increase, not 200. Now, Mary has done a couple surprising things here. She let us know that they have been holding this information from the public that we've been finding soft tissue for decades. We didn't know about it until 2000 and after. Papers might have been out there, but they weren't sensationalized. They didn't make the magazines. They weren't popularized. They were keeping that information from the people. Why? Because it ruins the paradigm, my friend. It ruins the paradigm. So, according to the tests, according to the information that she leaked, this has been going on for a long time. And there's been people who have known about this and kept this information from you, from the public. Kept it from going viral. And there's nobody doing the math. Why? Because the math proves they can't last 80 million years. They can't last 1 million years, let alone 65 or 80. Under 250,000 years. But it gets worse for them. Does it really? Yes, it does. Gets much worse. How's that? Well, when people found out about all this soft tissue in all these dinosaur bones, several of them, several horns, several bones, they gathered up a bunch of the samples, my friend, and they had them carbon-14 tested. Remember, you don't carbon-14 test anything that's over 55 or 60,000 years because you shouldn't find any carbon-14. But they found all this soft tissue. And the tests say that can't even be 250,000 years old. And that's at the uppermost limit. So let's C14 test these babies. So some Christians got a hold of several samples from several different dinosaurs, from several different digs, from several different museums, and they sent them out to several different labs. And guess what? They shouldn't have found any C14, but every single sample from every single dinosaur that was sent to every single lab came back young. It came back dated between 9,000 and 40,000 years old. Now that's amazing. So now you have two lines of science. Actual testing. Falsifiability. Are these things young? They sure test young. But the rock test's old. The tests that we run on those rocks using potassium, using uranium, these tests are telling us that those rocks are like nearly 100 million years old. Well, you were presupposing anyway when you chose your isotope, my friend. And you date shopped when you used this equipment and ran that test and the other equipment and ran that test and changed the conditions, cleaned up your your equipment a little bit, ran the test again, until you got that date that you wanted. And you presupposed on top of that it was at least 10 million years old. My friend, these tests are telling us that those rocks aren't even 100,000 years old. Not even. Not even. Not if the bones are testing C14 rich. Now, here's an interesting point. Bob Enyart, radio talk show host. Check this out. He actually calls the office of Jack Horner, Mary Schweitzer's boss, the atheist, the evolutionist, the Jurassic Park scientist, the one that really wanted to build a dinosaur out of the DNA he was hoping he could find in those bones. And he offered him, he said, look, I know a group of Christians that want to pay you $10,000 just to have that bone tested for C14. And we'll pay for the test. He wouldn't do it. He raised it to $20,000. And you know why he said he wasn't going to do it? Because, he said, of the spin that the Christians will get from this, the creationists, it's not going to do us any good. In other words, it sounds to me like he already ran those C14 tests because he knew it was going to come back young. It was going to come back C14 rich. Now, they're panicking so bad. Look what they're doing. They're writing papers like this. Now, let me show you this one first. This one says that creationists who try to degrade the carbon-14 tests should know that it is extremely reliable. These C14 tests are extremely reliable until they're testing the dinosaur bones, and then they're writing papers like this. You can't trust the C14 test because every single one of these was a false date. They tested young falsely. These are false dates. You can't trust them. Every single one was corrupted. Every single sample from every single dinosaur, from every single museum that was sent to every single lab, every one of them was corrupted. You can't trust the carbon-14 test anymore. But wait, it's the most reliable test out there. Make up my mind, Jack. Schweitzer earned her PhD by proving to the skeptics that they said, that's just biofilm. It's impossible that that's soft tissue. It can't possibly be soft tissue after 65 million years. Even she was amazed. She said, this is impossible, and yet there it was. So, she earned her PhD by proving her skeptics were wrong. That they weren't stupid. They really did discover soft tissue, and they understand the difference between biofilm and vascular tissue. Blood vessels, blood cells, collagen, keratin. These are all things that have been found in not just one dinosaur bone, but many now. Bones and horns from dinosaurs. So, Mary earned her PhD by proving her skeptics were wrong. She earned her PhD by proving the impossible really did happen. these soft tissues really were found someplace where it's just absolutely impossible. Now, there's basically two schools of thought when it comes to geology. There's something known as uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Now, catastrophism was held for a very long time, and then with the advent of evolution and Darwin and deep time and etc., everybody was fascinated with Darwin and evolution, so geology went the way of Darwin. They forsook catastrophism, even though we had lots of proof for catastrophism. Now, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a fellow named Harlan Bretz. Harlan Bretz visited often a place called the Scab Lands in the northwestern portion of the United States. Now, the Scab Lands are just amazing, and all the earth was washed off of the Scab Lands. Basalt rock, water, a furious amount of water dug into this basalt rock, dug huge holes like whirlpools. Oh, the devastation was just amazing. And nobody could really explain what happened there. Well, Harlan Bretz, I guess he kind of camped out there for most of his life. He was fascinated with the area. And he was a man of science. And despite the fact that uniformitarianism had taken control of everything, he understood that this wasn't some uniform, long, slow, drawn-out thing that happened in the Scab Lands. This was catastrophism. This was a huge, unbelievable catastrophe. So, he began to study it more. He dedicated his life pretty much to it. And he came up with the theory that this was definitely a catastrophe. Water did this damage. Some huge, massive, unbelievable flood. He estimated that the flood, the water that had to be available to do this was just unimaginable, which was part of the reason his theory was ridiculed. They said, where are you going to get all this water to do all this? Now, they saw the damage. Some of these people did. Some of them visited the area. Some of them did not. They just armchair quarterbacked. But even the people that saw that were sold on uniformitarianism, they ridiculed him because they said there's no water source that was able to do all of this. This had to be the result of millions and millions and millions of years of flooding. And, of course, they were wrong. People began finding more evidence to support Harlan, Mr. Bretz. And more and more evidence began to build up, and his idea started to catch on. It started to become more popular. And pretty soon, somebody found his water source. They said, we know where your water came from. And I believe it was in the 1970s, he was given an award. As an old man, he was justified. All the ridicule that he had undergone, and now he's vindicated. But he was kind of joking around. He says, the only thing I regret is that most of the people that ridiculed me are dead now. They didn't live to see this day, where he was totally vindicated. And now they know it was a catastrophic flood that carved out the Scab Lands. Unbelievable waterfalls, unbelievably wide, 3.5 miles wide this flow was. There were ice plugs. The glaciers were melting. An asteroid, well, more than one. Asteroids, we have evidence of several asteroids striking this area 12,500 years ago. They burst in the air. They started fires everywhere. The glaciers were melting. We had volcanic activity that began to warm the atmosphere. So as the glaciers were quickly melting, water was building up behind these ice plugs. Plugs of ice that were stretched across valleys. And when these ice plugs began to give way, just all of a sudden, now remember, this is Pangaea, one single continent. When these ice plugs began to give way, the water ripped, my friend. The water just ripped. They said that there was enough water behind this one ice plug. I think it was the Lake Missoula. Lake Missoula held enough water behind that ice plug that more water than is contained in every single river in the world was held back behind that ice plug. And when it gave way, man, was it a mighty whoosh. It destroyed absolutely everything in its path. Now, these ice plugs were giving away all over the world. And now, my friend, let's take a look at one more thing. Let's take a look at how fossils are formed. This is a very interesting point because it's hard to make a fossil. Fossils are formed when an animal dies, and it is immediately covered over with enough silt or mud and etc. to do a number of things. It's got to protect it from bacteria that would erode it, degrade it, rot it. It's got to protect it from predators. It's got to protect it from oxygen, because oxygen oxidizes and breaks down biological tissues. So, something has to die, and then it has to be quickly buried, and it has to be buried pretty deeply. And there has to be pressure applied to it to squeeze out as much oxygen as possible from the animal's body, as well as from the mud, silt, and etc. around it, as much as possible. Now let's consider these large formations and bone beds. We have an interesting thing called the Morrison Formation. Now, the Morrison Formation is extremely interesting because it takes up 16 states within the United States, and if you count 2 provinces of Canada. It's massive, a massive formation. Now, granted, the Morrison Formation, you could say that it's in the middle of a floodplain that takes up that much room. Now, are there bones scattered over every inch of that floodplain? No. Because, of course, there's ravines, there's upgrades, there's downgrades. So you have areas where there's very little bone in the Morrison Formation, and then you have areas where there's just massive amounts of bones just scattered about. disarticulated bones of every type of animal that you can imagine, from dinosaurs, reptiles, birds, mammals, fish, all kinds of marine life, all of them buried together. Now, we have massive evidence of floods during this period of time when these animals were buried. Massive amounts of evidence that there was seawater mixed in with this, because there's sea life, marine life mixed in with it. Now, they will tell you that all of these various bone beds, these animals were washed together. All of them, worldwide. They were all washed together. Now, this is a very interesting point. And then it looks like there was wave after wave after wave of silt and etc. washing in, and more animals washing in. Some of them weren't quite dead. You have a lot of disarticulated bones, bodies that were torn completely apart by the forces that raged to wash all these animals together. Lots of disarticulated bones of every sort of animal you can think of. And then you had some that were partially still together in body, and a few that were whole. You also have evidence that not all the animals were washed together, that were dead, because it looked like some of them might have gotten up and walked around a bit. You have some footprints here and there. But the evidence indicates that the floods kept occurring. They kept being washed together. Now, here's a couple other interesting facts. These fossils are buried in sandstone and limestone. Now, limestone has a marine element to it. It is made up of tiny little marine creatures. Their shells and skeletons crushed up, ground up together. That's what limestone is made of. That's what many of these dinosaurs and other creatures are buried in, limestone. Now, this limestone could have been brought up from the ocean floor during the breakup of Pangaea. Do you realize the massive activity that would have created? Just bringing everything at the bottom of the sea to the top, massive tsunamis being caused and washing all this stuff ashore, washing it across the land, washing it into these floodplains, and washing it over top of these skeletons, over top of these dead bodies, and burying them with so much pressure that it squished out the oxygen out of the bodies, out of the silt, out of the mud, enough to cover Brontosauri, enough to cover T-Rex, enough to cover Spinosaurus, enough to cover Triceratops, and all these other gigantic animals. Now, another interesting thing is, they say that during the Jurassic period, North America was covered with an inland sea. Now, I want you to look at this. Here's that inland sea. And now look at this. You know what this is? That's the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation sits in that inland sea. So what I'm saying is, that was no inland sea, my friend. If these animals are no older than 40,000 years old, and science proves that they're not, Science proves they can't be over 234,000 years old, and science further proves that they're between 9 and 40,000 years old. Somewhere in there. The only time period that could possibly have fit to where we could have an inland sea and all these animals washed into that area was during the Younger Dryas, 12,500 years ago. That's the same period of time that the Scab Lands were formed, a little bit west of there. So it was this water from those glaciers that washed into that area, that washed these animals together. We had the exact same things that created that catastrophe that they say created the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous catastrophes. We had the asteroids bursting in the air, landing in Greenland and North America and who knows where else. One continent, my friend. The world was one continent at the time, they tell us. So, roughly 12,500 years ago, this Earth was one continent. More catastrophism with the breakup of the continents. What kind of havoc did that wreak in just a little bit of time? You see, all the floods now, of the Triassic floods, all these asteroid strikes that they say occurred during 250 million years of Earth history, that was gradualism, my friend. That was gradualism. But we have the proof that these bones are not that old, and we have the proof that within that time period, we had this catastrophism that formed the Scab Lands that would have also washed those animals together inside the Morrison Formation, which was later passed off as an inland sea. So we've got some fascinating stuff going on here, my friend. These bones cannot be millions of years old. Face it. The only time period that all of this stuff could have happened is the Younger Dryas. And isn't it amazing that during the Younger Dryas, everything that they say happened in the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous happened during the Younger Dryas. Everything. And more. You had the asteroid strikes, you had the massive volcanic flooding of lava, you had massive flooding sloshing back and forth across the earth. The sea level rose 400 feet, my friend. 400 feet in that little short period of time. That's catastrophism. All of the things that they say took 200 million years are compressed now in a time period of perhaps months, weeks. So imagine the catastrophe. Imagine the death toll. It's no wonder 96% of all the animals died. We saw a global flood. They even call it global flood, my friend. They say these floods were global. And if you pack that 250 million years they said they had, that they don't, because science proves they don't, they have less than 40,000 years. If you pack that 250 million years worth of destruction within this period of time, you've got catastrophism of unprecedented. You just can't imagine. So it's fascinating, my friend. We have proof of a global flood. They call it a global flood, but they try to disguise it and say, well, it took place over 250 million years, so it wasn't really a global flood. And yet they call it one. Everything, every bit of evidence points to it. So there you have it, my friend.